there's the educational use of technology, there's hybrid classrooms, there's blended learnings, there's all these terms. But in reality, like, what's the objective? Like?
Hello, and you're very welcome along to another edition of the Staffroom. You just heard Dermott Walsh there talking about the Digital Learning Document 2020. Himself and Helen O'Kelly go through the document, and they ask the question, what are the objectives? What are you hoping to get out of this Digital Learning 2020 document? What is blended learning? And more importantly, what is blended learning to you? So each of them asked the question, what is blended learning, and how technology is applied to blended learning and how it affects the students. I hope you can stay with us. It's definitely worth a listen. Don't forget, as always, you can get us at CESI Tweets on Twitter. You can get me directly at Hassanaba on Twitter. And of course, you can get us on the CESI website. That's the Computers and Education Society of Ireland website. That's www.cesi.ie. We have an online forum there of about 2,000 teachers. We want to hear from you. If you're a teacher in education, third level, primary, post-primary, then you want to be on that list. Feel free to ask any questions, and the list supports itself. We're open source at its best. So I'm going to hand you back to Dermott, and he's going to finish his discussion about digital learning and blended learning and what it means to you.
Like, I think we both mentioned, and it was highlighted in the report, that the educational use of technology at primary and post-primary, that there should be a focus on knowledge creation, I think is the term that they use. So I think that the digital learning framework, for example, builds on the UNESCO ICT Teachers Competence Framework. And like, if we push everything aside, so all these terms, I think we discussed this last week as well, where I think we both enjoyed the idea that this is just learning now, that never mind hybrid learning, never mind blended learning, or all of those terms. So what is knowledge creation then, or how do we achieve that in schools? I'm just looking at it there on page 19, and it says that from the observations of the inspectorate, in primary school, it was about 45% of lessons could be said to have aligned with knowledge creation, and in post-primary lessons, it was about 52% is my reading of that chart there. What's your interpretation of knowledge creation, Helen?
So my interpretation is that where you're giving students tasks, they've learned a certain amount in whatever, let's say, the content and some, let's say, software applications that they're going to be using. Okay, and I'm talking across any subject here, and that they have to, like, whether individually or as a group, they have to create something new out of that through technology, using some sort of software application, so that it is the students' individual interpretation of the content that they've been taught, and that they can develop it in, maybe it is as a podcast, or it's a film, or it's a coding artifact, which is a game, or an interactive quiz, or it could be a presentation that has sort of animations in it, or this interaction. So it's what the students, either individually or as a group, how they interpret it given the skills. So it's it's just a new sort of way, a different mode of interpretation to what would have maybe been done before, in a more sort of static, sort of on the paper type of an accomplishment.
Yeah, and that's important, isn't it? Because there's three stages in that UNESCO document. I think in the digital learning framework there are two stages. There's effective practice and highly effective practice, obviously, and that's key to it, isn't it? So we're obviously trying to move away from traditional teacher-led approaches to educational use of technology. Even then, we're trying to move away from, I think the term they use is knowledge deepening, which in my own interpretation is very kind of individually constructivist, and it's towards these socio-cultural, socially constructivist, towards those type of learning environments. requirements, that they're really looking for evidence of educational use of technology, for example. And there's obviously challenges with that, because my understanding is that we're trying to prepare the students for a future which we don't really understand yet, where they're going to be working in jobs which haven't been created yet, and they're going to be solving problems which we don't even know exist yet, for example. And that's very hard for any teacher then, isn't it, to sit down in the morning, and they're teaching Irish, or they're teaching history, or they're teaching English, and they're saying, well, how can I get my students to engage in a knowledge creation approach while working within, I suppose, the system as it is, for example. So I know at primary school, I have 10, 11 subjects that I need to teach during the week. And is it achievable for me to take a knowledge creation approach, or is there anything that we could say could assist a teacher to engage in a knowledge creation approach?
Mm-hmm. And I mean, and that there certainly are challenges, I think, with that knowledge creation. And I think one of them is time and the timetable, and the demands that students have if they're doing many projects in this similar vein. Trying for students to manage their time. And I think what one of the key things here are looking at the key skills, which is communication, making sure that it's very clear to the students that they know what the parameters are, that it's, and they know when the deadlines are, what's expected. In terms of assessment, if it's at junior cycle, understanding what the marking scheme is, and understanding that there's, there needs to be reflection process as well on the projects that they make. But to boil it down, I think it is if you as a teacher are managing projects like this is as you say, it's not necessarily you're not standing at the front dictating what they have to do. You're handing over the responsibilities to the students and in their groups, and you as a teacher then have to manage these groups. So certainly my experience, I teach in computer science at Leaving Cert, is that we have to do these 4 group projects, and so I sort of manage it like as if I'm a software developer manager. And so you have
that's your background, Helen, is it, as well?
Yeah, that's my background. So I would have worked in industry, and so the way I do it is that you have X amount of weeks to do it, so they have a schedule to follow. Broadly speaking, you have to temper that to whatever year they're in or whatever age group they're in. But
so
also,
what years do you teach, Helen? What years do you
teach? First to 6th year. So I teach computer studies from 1st to 6th year. So that would be digital literacy, plus I infuse it with programming projects. And then I would teach Leaving Cert Computer Science, which is obviously 5th and 6th year. But I suppose what you're thinking about is with the difficulties of knowledge creation is managing the projects and managing the groups, and they managing themselves. So you need to have sort of processes in place to do all that. So you have your learning management system. So it could be if you're working in Google, or if you're using OneNote, or if you're using any other collaborative sort of systems, that you're managing they are managing their projects, by sharing documents, and that they're all contributing. Because, again, you're not only doing knowledge creation, you're managing group projects, and you want to try and get as much, input from all of the students as possible, and they're, building up their strengths, I suppose.
So if I walked into your classroom then, right? So what you're trying to describe there is that you take certainly a project approach, a collaborative project approach to the teaching of computer science in secondary school.
Yes.
Okay.
I would. So I'm teaching. So what I do as well is, like, I have my first year. Sorry to cut across you there, Dermott. Yeah. My first years, I'm sort of introducing them to what effectively is the way I teach computer science at 5th and 6th year. And so what I'm doing then is they know what they know they have to work out what their roles are. teachers would be used to this, because like there would be certain roles, but also making sure that they understand what those roles mean, what are the tasks and the responsibilities for that. So again, I'm coming from a computer science, but just bear in mind it could be in any subject, so you've got maybe a recorder, you've got someone who's going to do the checking that everything is in place, the production of it, so you'll know depending what it is. And then also when the project starts, and it's taken me, and I'm still refining it, is when those projects start. So you could be in a class, and I've been in classes with 27, 28. So let's say, I typically have 3 in a group, maybe 4. So you're talking about like maybe 9 to 10 groups in a class. So it's noisy. If you were to walk into my classroom, it's noisy, but then sometimes it's very concentrated. They're concentrating. And what you have to do as a teacher then is, and again, it depends on how long, I have 1 hour classes, you're going around. So maybe one of the classes, you're doing a little bit of theory at the beginning, but then you say, okay, off you go now. You have to work in your groups. So they're sitting around maybe a couple of computers, or if you're not in the computer lab, they're working together. They might have their devices, they might not. And then you go around and you're working hard as a teacher, because you're walking around to each of the classes, or each of the groups, I should say, and you're saying, okay, how are you getting on? What problems have you had to solve? What problems are still outstanding? And critically what I ask them is, okay, and I indicate this to them at the beginning, if everything's on task, do you reckon you're agreeing? Okay. If you're having any problems, with your project, and it could be technical, or it could be, trying to get, in an interview, there could be some, or, there could be some other issues. They might be in an orange, but they're in the process of solving it. Or are they in a red? Red means that there might be something major that they can't manage, so they might need help from you, or maybe they're not working. It could be as simple as that. So each week you're going around, or each class, or, you work it out yourself, and asking them. And so what you also have to do is you have to track that, so that they can see that you are tracking that, and that you also are being responsible towards them. You're managing them, but they're also managing themselves. And I don't say, when we're in the middle of these projects, I said, I'm not giving you homework. You know what you have to do, and they do know what they have to do, and that's very empowering.
Yeah. And so right. So for example, if we were to imagine a traditional class with the teachers up at the whiteboard, and even at this stage, I think that concept is long gone, if you know what I mean. But you're not, so when you go in and you start your class, I think you said there that there is some kind of some bit of theory you teach maybe at the beginning. Would that be right?
Yeah.
And then how are you structuring that? Are there any models? Like, are there any? So if a teacher was to watch this show and they were saying, "Oh, I'd love to take that approach that Helen O'Kelly's taken," for example, what kind of models are there available for a teacher to structure this type of learning?
So you mean pedagogical models?
Yes, yeah.
So what I do is I'm using the Bridge 21 learning model. Okay, so that's it's been developed by Trinity College, and so I did, I've done the certificate in Trinity for that. So what it essentially is, it's an iterative model. It's an active learning model. So you have like a warm-up session, investigative session, and then you go on, and there's a reflective session and presentations sessions.
Yes, they are going through this process.
Yeah, okay. And you might end up like say in your class, you might get to, let's say at the end of the class or during your class, you're just going through the investigative sort of part of the model, and that you might iterate that over a number of classes in that week or for a couple of weeks, and that's absolutely fine. And then and it's quite fluid as well. You might go back and forth between the creative and the investigative, and so it's in that investigative part is where I would be explaining a little bit of theory to them, and then they have to go off and to create. And then as the project progresses, they're going on through that model to the point where then they're presenting. And typically what I do is when they're presenting, I invite people to come in to them. So, and they wouldn't necessarily be teachers in the school, they'd be external. And that is very, very powerful. And then at the end, then they reflect, and reflection is really key. It's an evaluation of their work of their project, you know, and, you know, like we're, you know, we'd be very familiar with doing that, but it's that combination of that model, you know, that is, it's very powerful, and it augments the key skills that are in junior cycle and at senior cycle. You know, would you do something like that, Dermot, in your classes?
Yeah,
You know,
so the two of us have that shared experience, I think, of experiencing certainly the Bridge 21 model. And I would agree with you, like it's supposed to explain to people it's a model where it's a 21st century learning model where individuals work as part of a team, and there's a specific team methodology within it. I think that comes from the Scouts, if I'm right. It's based on the patrol system of the Scouts. And then there's maybe 7 steps in a process. So the team come together, they engage in is it an icebreaker? They warm up, or they might do a bit of brainstorming or whatnot. Then they're given a problem, and in the problem, then they have to sit down. They have to make their own. They have to make sense of the problem. And I think, as you were saying last night, with all of the groups in your classroom, because of the different combination of the different variables, which are the individuals, they each make sense of the problem differently. So if you and I and Hassan were to sit down and come with a problem, we might come up with a different problem than three other people would, for example, because we all have we've different schema, I suppose, haven't we? Or we look at the world differently. I think that the model tries to extract that. Then they come up with a problem. Do they test the problem with users at some stage?
Yes, so
then they have to present it, I think, isn't that right, to the rest of the group?
Yeah.
They engage in a question and answering session, and then they reflect on the whole process. That there's a group reflection, individual reflection. I think that's it broadly. Certainly, you might have missed a couple of stages. But you're saying that how can you ensure, I suppose, that the key skills that you're teaching, how can you ensure that the kids are learning them? Because if someone walks into your class, for example, and they see 8 or 9 groups, I know when I've used it in primary school, you know, you might have 3 or 4 people sitting on desks. They might be tearing up paper. Somebody else might be painting a box. Somebody else might be walking across the classroom to another group. And traditionally, and this I think is where we differ, as we hit on a point last night, is maybe our experiences of coming in to teaching are a little bit different, in the sense that your teacher training was based around this model, I think. Is that correct? Whereas mine, I came from, which I would consider to be a very constructivist background, which was Freble College of Education. But when I'm in primary school, I suppose I'd feel a little bit, I'd have inhibitions, certainly, and I don't know why, after the conversation we had last night, of using the Bridge model all day long in every class or in any subject. Because, as we said, like, there's certain key skills there, which the kids, you feel that they have to know. Do you know what I mean? And in a traditional school environment, there was an established way of ensuring that kids at least were exposed to the content that you were teaching. You know, if either of us stood up at the top of the classroom, used an interactive whiteboard and taught something formally, I guess, we could at least write in our plans, yep, the kids experience that may not be the best way of learning. So why is the Bridge, and why is this a better way of learning then, or why does this hit on this knowledge creation area?
Okay, so there's a lot of questions there, Dermot.
Sorry, yes.
No, that's okay. So I think so I want to break this down a little bit. So the first question then is just about the key skills. So what we want is they're working in groups, and even if they're not working in groups, if they're working individually, okay, if it happens to be that case, the key skills, if we look at them, is communication, it's problem solving, it's being creative, it's managing yourself, okay, and working with others. And even if you were doing an individual project, chances are, you know, again, regardless of any subject that you're teaching, and there will be times when you have to go and talk with somebody else, maybe to get inspiration or to bounce something off somebody. So that's another way. So students have to, let's say they've been given this deadline and they could be working about 6 or 7 projects, broadly in the same time frame. So managing themselves is key. So you as the teacher also have to be helping them, and that's why you have to be working with them class on class, or at least once a week in the again, depending on how your timetable works, to make sure that they are working steadily through through the project. Okay, now they could hit problems, and if they hit problems, you say, this is life, this happens. What we want to do is, you might be in some sort of a cul-de-sac, whether it's technically or otherwise, but what you're learning there is that if that happens, then you either persevere and try and work that out, and that's great, or you might have to backtrack a bit and change tack and go another way in creating this content that you want to, or product, the artifact that you're trying to create. So there's like, I'm just skimming over there. That's sort of the key skills there that you're talking about. So then there's the content. Okay, so I would take the opportunity. It's not me just letting each group and each class is always a group project. There has to be, well, certainly in my experience, you do have to stand at the front. There are times when you do have to stand at the front and explain some like, say, theoretical aspect to it, or but again, there's opportunities. I would sit, I have reasonably, sometimes much smaller classes, like say 10 or 12 students. I have them in a sort of semicircle in front of me, use your show me boards, like your, all this, there's all various interactive things you could do. And if you're doing this as, let's say remote teaching, you could get them to, there's whiteboards that you can use in, let's say in Teams or Zoom or whatever. They could be writing answers there, or they contribute, you can do, you can work out these different things yourself. But you've got learning outcomes, and what you're trying to do is, those projects in the first place should be, designed in such a way that they're, they're encompassing the learning outcomes, and so that that is the content, that you're delving at. Now, from a computer science perspective, they're reasonably open, but they, students have to learn how to code, for example. They have to learn how to read error messages. They need to learn how to test. So that's very broad, but yet it's very specific when they're actually working on a project. So that's where, and we had quite a lot of discussion last night about how do you know that they've learned, that they've achieved those learning outcomes. And so in a sort of, I suppose, a practical subject, you can see what they've coded, you can see how they they can talk to you in those, when you're talking with them, when you're going around and saying, well, how did you solve that problem there? Or also what I do as well is I have a design process log, and that's just a name that I came up with. You could call it whatever you want, but basically I use OneNote, and they have all these sort of pages, and they're writing, it's like a little journal, each of them in their group. Or if it was an individual project, I'm training them to write down the problems, because sometimes when you're writing it, that's when it triggers how to fix something, and that's the learning. You get those aha moments. So that's what, and so I'm talking, that's in a very specific domain. If it's in, let's say if it was in Irish or maths or geography.
You were saying this, like, is it, so you're saying, so obviously your background is computer science anyway, is that right? You worked as a
well, it was
software
IT
technician?
Yeah, tech support and programmed, and so that would be my background.
So when you're coming into teaching computer science, then, for example, you can teach them domain-specific skills because you have that knowledge, right? And then you can use the Bridge 21 model. You can certainly justify the process by introducing those domain-specific skills and things that you've mentioned there, like a design log, for example, which sounds industry. Is it a diary, or is it
it's like a series of pages? So let's say page 1, and it's just a OneNote page. So one would be, like, what's the name of your group? Okay. What's
Yeah.
your rule for the group? What are the roles, you know, and
Mhm.
what's, you know, who is your audience, you know, like who's going to use this digital artifact, you know? So that could be for any project in any domain, that, you know, any subject that, you know, it's not just specific to, say, a computer science project, you know? So, and these are strands that are coming up from the Bridge 21, you know, where you have roles and rules, and, you know, and then the next one would be brainstorming. Well, you know, you have that in any project that you would do at primary or secondary. So you're, you know, you can be throwing down, you know, any screenshots or scribbles or anything like that. And then I would then have, this would be maybe very specific to, say, to computer science projects. You would have user requirements. So they would be like, say, for things, if you're doing a game, well, look at that, the arrows, you know, that if you press the up arrow, yes, it does go up, you know what I mean? But
Yeah,
I'm just saying, if it was geography, you know, for example, and I'm just thinking out loud, well, you want to see, you know, what would the user want to see? Well, they want to see some graphs, for example, you know, so that, you know, it would be, make some of the text more alive. So that might be, you know, if you think of it like that, and then you
yeah,
go on and you have your algorithm, which are your steps to go through that. So I'm trying to think, if it was, let's say, history, you know, I mean, you might have your headings, you know, that's your algorithm in a history essay, are your headings. So as you go through that, you know, and you just
yeah,
keep on progressing through the whole design process of it. And
yeah,
that's really what it is, to the point where you're end up presenting and reflecting. And I think that's, you know, applicable, and it can be tweaked, obviously, to whatever subject you're doing. And it's like very metacognitive, and that's a big term, but basically you're thinking about what you're thinking, you know?
and that's it. By going through the process and by the kids themselves recording the process and then reflecting on it, they do, the next time they go through it, for example, the next iteration, they then begin to think about how they're thinking. I think that's one of
Yes.
the keys
Yeah.
to it. So, like, yeah, that was the issue, wasn't it? Or that was one of the issues we mentioned, like, the assessment of it, for example. So this design log, or what we could say maybe a learning journal, for example, or
Yeah.
some records of it as they go through. You can then sit down, you can view that. That's the traditional copybook, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So if the, like, and this came up again as well. Like, if the inspector walked in and said, "Well, can you show me how you're assessing this?" You've assessed it through a design log, or you could assess it through a journal or a diary, for example. And then how do you make sure that the group isn't dominated by, you know, the Hassan of the group, for example, the extraordinarily talented child who sits in the class? Like, how do you ensure that if they're in groups of 3 or 4, that each member is appropriately contributing or legitimately
Yes.
participating? I think, yeah,
Absolutely, and that's a really important question. And also, again, if you were thinking that, let's say, in terms of assessment, and also if you were to be inspected, you know, that you know, that everybody is given an opportunity to contribute to the project. So let's say, I suppose I have two hands. I have the, you know, when I'm doing these projects, I have, and let's say, on one side, I have the actual project that they're creating. So it could be a podcast, it could be a video, it could be, you know, a website, whatever. And then on the other side, I have what I call the design process log, which is, you know, them documenting the journey. They're thinking about how they created that. There are
okay,
many
yeah,
roles. There are many roles that can be, you know, divvied out to students, and the students will, you know, they will know themselves where their strengths are, and so they will tend, and this is my experience, they will tend to stick to their strengths, and sometimes time is really important, you know, and what will happen is they revert to whoever's the strongest will get it over the line.
yes,
So
yeah,
that's what but I suppose the point is, if you have that design process log, so, you know, let's say if you were making a podcast, someone might be really strong at writing the script, you know, and then somebody else is, you know, has got a good track record in editing it and so on, where somebody else might be the filmmaker, or someone, you know, else is the person who manages the whole thing, keeps it all
yeah,
together. So
yeah,
there's those different types of roles, and if you And then the other important thing is the person who's recording that. So I would always have someone who is responsible to make sure that the group is completing their design process log, you know, and that is a big responsibility because, you know, when I go back to assessing it, I can see where there's gaps and, you know, or there may not be. And, you know, that you can, and that usually, well, not always, but like usually the standard of the design process log is sort of in correlation with the actual project, you know.
Yeah.
So, but you do have to trying to balance the net contributors to the project.
Okay.
And then the framework I use to assess mine are, I use the junior cycle assessment. So that would be, you know,
This is specifically computer science.
Well,
Again,
it's used at junior cycle. So, you know, yet to meet expectations, meets expectations, above expectations, exceeds expectations. So I have used that, you know, that's how I assess those big projects, you know, so that they know that. So I look at, so when I'm assessing them, I'm looking at and bear in mind that they're also going to present this to like external people coming into my class.
yeah.
Their classmates will also be witnessing that presentation too. And also I'm, you know, assessing how they're presenting as well, you know, so you're working really, you know, it's a very different sort of dynamic, you know, where you're working in the background. So there's that assessment. There's the assessment of the design process log. And then now I have smaller classes, so I do have the capacity, but I would talk with each of my students on an individual basis. This is, and to say, how did you contribute? What problems did you solve? You know, how would you evaluate, you know, and I give them, you know, say a certain percentage. So that will distinguish, they'll get a group mark. They'll get their individual mark, but some of it will be group and some is individual. So that makes it kind of fair. And if you iterate, if you repeat that over, let's say from first year to third year, students will learn, you know, that this is what they have to contribute. And what I would also say when I'm talking to them individually, and it might not be, you know, this might be during the course of the whole project, is that you'll see where they'll revert to their strongest, you know, sort of skill set. And you say, okay, your challenge now is that you have to, you know, switch to another one, because ultimately, again, I go back to computer science, they have to do an individual project. So you're trying to get them rounded so that when they'll be comfortable enough, you know, given their capabilities to get that point. So, and then they have to do a reflection, you know. So I think you've got assessment there, you've got reflection, you know, if someone was inspecting, you've got it all documented, and you know, so you're just trying to think as many things as possible.
So there's a couple of things there. So first of all, like they're obviously practicing, I suppose, the 4 C's, if you know what I mean. They're communicating, collaborating, they're creating, and they have to think critically as well. Certainly through reflection, through logging, all of that. So like that's, you can guarantee by going through this process that they're engaging in those skills, certainly. And then what you've mentioned as well there, if we go back to your example of the script. So if we were to say, and sometimes Irish is a very good one to highlight, because there are challenges in teaching Irish, there's challenges in kids learning Irish that maybe are, I don't know if it's fair to say if they're certainly general, but you know, there's a perception around Irish, for example, that sometimes it's maybe not as engaging to learn, I suppose, from a kid's perspective. But when you're mentioning there that if they were to do a podcast, or if they were to write a short TV show or a short documentary, they actually have to use the original kind of the 3 R's there, don't they? They have to, there's reading, there's writing, there's obviously arithmetic in computer science, for example, as well. But they're still honing those skills as well. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
You know, because to read, they're reading, you know, they might have to read information, you know, that to get something to work, you know, and like, again, you know, like that, you know, if it was Irish, you know, you're looking at different resources and stuff like that. If you're using technology to create, okay, how do you make a, you know, a podcast? So they have to read something there. Then the writing, they're writing a script, they're refining all of that. They might have a voiceover, so they have to do that. They might have subtitles,
Yeah.
so it's very exciting. And if you're, doing things through technology, you can really lift it up, and then
Yeah.
there's the whole, you might want to make it accessible as well, so that, let's say your English is not your first language, you could translate from Irish to Lithuanian or something like that. Do you know what I mean? There's so many things, and that's just, and then you've got the arithmetic, so you might be doing things like the timings of your script, and this is, again, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, okay, at 1 minute we have to have this, ticked in, how many screenshots or how many frames do you have per minute to get that. So there's maths happening in a very live and practical way, and students aren't even sort of like maybe necessarily cognizant of what they're doing, at such a high level.
Yeah, and so like that's one of the key things. So for example, so I have experience as well of learning through the Bridge 21 model, and I also have experience of trying to implement it in the primary school in that domain. So I'm a primary school teacher, obviously. One of the things that I found, so you use this is your standard classroom. I think we established last night. Is it? It's not my standard classroom, and I spent, I won't say all night wondering about this, thank God, but I certainly spent some time wondering about it. Is why not, like, why? Because I've experienced it. I've worked with people. I often highlight that when we started off, it was during the Masters in Technology and Learning. That's where I first experienced it. That I worked with, in our group, there was a lecturer and he had a doctorate. So when we were working together, his writing skills were extraordinary. They were so far away from my own when we were sitting down to write, that I learned, I suppose I reflected on myself and learned that my writing skills were, that maybe they were the best in my primary school class, but that's because I was the teacher, if you know what I mean. But they weren't that good outside of that, and that I had skills deficiencies which I needed to develop, if that makes sense. And I know that when you put a group of kids together as well, they see something similar. I think that's fair to say, and there's certainly a motivation there, isn't there, for them?
Absolutely. And then I agree with that. And so students are seeing, and actually it goes back to, if you have someone that is particularly strong and you see that what I've learned to do, and again, this is me reflecting, I said, okay, now make sure, you say, make sure that you're explaining that to the others in the group. Okay.
Yeah.
And so they then are getting even more clear in their heads, and they will, hopefully they should be explaining it in such a way that the other students can understand it, and that boils down to communication is key. And so the student, let's say the stronger student in this instance, or might have to temper the words that they use to explain it in such a way so that the other students understand it. And what you're also saying is that you're giving them the opportunity of what can be done, and this is, oh my goodness, so this is how you work this out. And again, it goes back to different roles. So, like you could do, like say in a computer science project, you would have testers, and, in order to test, you're trying to break it. But you have to understand what you're trying to break, so, and it would be the same maybe if, let's say if you go back to, let's say if you're French, you're doing a podcast or you're doing a video. So you get someone to test the video or, to watch it. Does that make sense? So there's different ways of testing, your artifacts, or you could go back to your users and just say, watch that. Does that make sense to you? And they'll tell you. So that's different ways of testing it.
So for example, when you're the teacher in that environment, the kids are working together, and there's a zone of proximal development happening naturally, because kids have different strengths. Some kids may be stronger at coding, some may be stronger at algorithmic thinking, some may be stronger leaders, some may be stronger whatever. Do you know what I mean? That's happening in there. So like this is the process, this is the pedagogy. And what's the role of the technology then in it?
So the role of the technology is because the like that design the role of technology is that it's all been done through technology. So
Yes.
so that's the role. So it should be, you know, and it takes years, you know, to teach the, like those 5th years and 6th years. They've been doing it with me for 4 years. So
Yes.
they are, so for example, if, you know, let's say we'll go back to, it happened to be a French class, they are creating a video. So what the technology there is they're filming, they're editing, you know, and that's just part of it. I mean, the students shouldn't even be thinking that of technology. That's just how they do it. And
yeah, but isn't this the key, Helen? Isn't this the key? Because there's this misconception, or sorry, maybe it's not a misconception, but certainly, and we touched on this briefly last night, is that when we talk about the educational use of technology, and I know this from my own research and reading, that often the student learning outcomes that are highlighted are, oh, the kids were more engaged, the kids were more active in their learning, the kids really enjoyed using technology. And I think we said that that's grand, but you could put a seal up in the front of your classroom for about 20 minutes. The kids would be more active, they'd be more engaged and all of that. But when we're talking about educational use of technology, certainly I know from my own background, because of the experiences I've had of doing a master's and trying to do a PhD, and from experiencing a 21st century learning model, there's much deeper learning outcomes there, and the technology is only used to enhance that
yeah,
learning. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair to say. It's the vehicle in which you are
Yeah.
creating the content. And you know, the content, I'm going to try and think of another example. Let's say if it was like, let's say okay, home economics. Okay, let's
Yeah.
say what's the technology there? So you might be making a YouTube video on how to, you know, make, you know, an apple tart. Okay, so you think about that it's quite involved, because you have to have your, you know, the oven, the timings, you know, here's your maths, you know, because and your shots and the lighting, and make sure that what happens if it burns, you know, there's your problem solving. Do you have to start over again? Can you, you know, so there's just so many different ways of learning. So if you were to look at home economics, what's the content there is how to make the apple tart, but then
Yes.
you're also trying to film it at the same time, and all that goes in, and that would be a really interesting project actually to do, because you have someone who has to get their script right, and I say it's really challenging, and you have someone who has to make sure that the end product looks lovely. You know,
Yes. Yeah, that would be really interesting. Yeah. No, and that's the key to this, isn't it? Because again, there just is sometimes I found, maybe even I had that myself in the past, was that, you know, if you were a teacher and you were good at technology, that meant you were a modern teacher, if you know what I mean, or more modern teacher. But that's not what we're talking about at all. Like it's this deep learning which is embedded within these models, for example.
yeah,
And then the educational use of technology is just to enhance
yeah,
that learning. But the core of it is this pedagogy, isn't it? It's collaborative, it's people working together, people coaching and mentoring each other, as you said, metacognition, having to record the process you're going through, having to reflect on it, present it, be interviewed on it. Like, it's a much deeper learning experience maybe than people are aware. Because, and we mentioned this last night as well, that I know, again, from reading in the area, for example, that a lot of teachers tend to agree that certainly constructivist, socially constructivist approaches to teaching and learning are the kids are they engage in deeper learning, for example. But yet you often find that there are things which restrict them from actually taking on that approach across the whole year. And I do this myself, and it's bizarre because there are sometimes you walk into my classroom and I'm standing at the board and I'm just demonstrating. You know, it could be long multiplication, it could be long division, but yet in the back of my mind, I know there's a better way of learning it. And there are certain barriers there, if that makes sense. So, like certainly, I know from reports I've read, sometimes teachers feel that around exam time, for example, they move away from constructivist, socially constructivist teaching. They go back to didactic, teacher-led instruction because they can guarantee the students in their classroom will at least be exposed to the content, if you know what I mean. Or there's parental expectations. Like, I know you're teaching a new subject, but like, have parents, and I suppose not never to name anybody, but have parents ever expressed concerns and say, well, Helen, like, you know, your kids are all working together, like you're not doing much teaching, like, or have colleagues ever kind of mentioned anything like that? Because I've had it once or twice in the past, and I can understand why it happened. Do you know?
No one said yet,
Because
not yet, but I'm waiting.
not yet. No, yeah. But like it's but that's your background, isn't it? That's your teaching background.
Yeah.
This is your,
This is my
this is your tabula rasa, isn't that what they call it? The yeah. This is your one. Yeah. And do you think that was different? Like, is
I don't know.
Beneficial? Yeah.
I don't know if it's different. Is it beneficial? Well, to me, it makes sense because I've seen it in industry. And you know, and I love reading books about you know, technology and projects. And I just it's collaboration. So communication is really, really key, but collaboration is also absolutely fundamentally key to group projects. And even again, I say, if you know, and there's some people who you know, there's lots of students who don't like doing group projects, you know,
yes.
But they have to work within a team, and that's life, you know. So, but I suppose in either way, it's to understand that there are times when you'll hit you know, a wall, or that you just need to reach out to people, you know, and to get different inputs, you know, to bounce the idea off, even if you just talk to somebody. And they might not say a word to you, and yes. You're talking to them, you know, actually makes it clear to you, and you might go back. Now that, you know, but so that's what I'm trying to say there is that yes, you could be, you know, you might like working by yourself all the time, but students have to realize that they do have to work in teams. Yeah. Some might be very tightly coupled, others might be very loose, you know, but you can't, you know, you won't go through life working by yourself. So that's why these key skills are really important, and that those pedagogical models are really, really important in augmenting these skills and highlighting it. And also I would say another sort of experience is like I have to work hard, you have to work hard at getting students to fill in this design process log, you know what I mean? They want to go straight into that project and make the video, make the whatever, the website, whatever. You are working really hard to get them used to that thinking process, you know. Don't think it's easy. It's not easy at all to get them to do that, you know. And you could be breaking habits of a lifetime as well.
That's a big thing, isn't it? Because I think, like in most, certainly our generation, obviously there's teachers now who are from a different generation, which is frightening in some ways that we're not the youngest generation anymore. But what do I mean? That I mean that my experiences of teaching and learning for the most part were didactic. You know, there was a teacher up at the top of the classroom and they were teaching. And I think you mentioned this last night, that they were very effective teachers as well. Absolutely. For example, and it was, to a certain extent, or some elements of it were of huge benefit, if you know what I mean. But they're not the skills we need anymore. Like, isn't that right? Last night we said that there was kind of a different reasoning process. That, like, when you came out of that when you came out of those primary or secondary school experiences, which have been predominantly didactic, you'd have bloody good memory. Do you know what I mean? And you could write out answers that you've memorized. But were there skills you were lacking then when you went into industry? Like, how was your ability to collaborate, or how was your ability take
Yeah,
part
you
as a team.
know. So it'll be very interesting. I know. So that would have been my experience of, primary and secondary school,
Yeah.
what you described. So like when I went into third level, actually, and this is decades ago, we actually did have to work, like not always, but we did have to do group projects, and it was hard,
Yes.
and it caused lots of problems. And people would be trying to get into groups where they knew where all the workers were, you know what I mean, like
Yeah.
everyone knows, but but what I think the students now are lucky because they're learning this from a very young age. So hopefully, they've when they get on to third level, they're more likely, I think, to ask questions, to be more confident in asking those questions because they've been afforded these opportunities to present. I mean, I don't think I presented until I was in working.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. And
I
that's
was in my
such a
twenties. I'm just trying.
such a necessary skill, isn't it?
You know,
To be able to
uh,
present.
and then now we have this whole dimension where we're going to be, working globally. I mean, the companies I was working in global organizations. So you're talking with people of different cultural backgrounds. Now,
Yeah.
like Ireland is different much different now to when it was 20 years ago, but it's a given that you're going to be working with people of different cultures, backgrounds. You're going to be working with people who are in different countries, different time zones. Some people will be in the room beside you, some won't, and you have to be the key skill of communicating, being really clear in the way you enunciate words, and using words that make sense to everyone in the room, which that's quite hard at times, and also collaborating, with people that are, face to face all around the world, different time zones. These are the skills. But I do think, that doesn't mean that there will be times when people have to stand up. Teachers will have to stand up and talk to you and explain things that there are times, and I do that. I mean, it's not
Yeah.
all everyone working out in groups and it's all, but
Yeah.
it's a steer. I think it's a really strong steer. And then
Yeah. And
going back to what you were saying there about, like, sort of, let's say you're heading into the last couple of months before, let's say, a Leaving Cert exam. You're just trying to make sure that you cover everything, and it's understanding. That's what you want, is understanding, so that the students, feel confident and have practiced enough in
yeah.
different scenarios.
Knowledge creation is possible, but we have come to some form of consensus that it's the pedagogy behind it more so than the technology, which will enable teachers to actually achieve it.
Absolutely, yeah, I agree. And I think what's interesting is, at the start we were talking about, sort of blended learning, hybrid classroom, remote teaching, being in the classroom. But I was just finishing up there saying that when you're working in industry, and who knows, but certainly it happens now, students will be with their peers in the room in the office, say, for example. Some will be in, dialing in from other parts of Ireland. Some will be coming from other parts of the world. So they're dealing with people from different time zones, different locations, some through computers, some in front of them. And I think that's why this is a serious opportunity. And the pedagogy is there that underpins all of this, and technology is the vehicle. I don't know if you want to add anything more to that.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely perfect. It's been wonderful talking to you as always, Helen.
And likewise. And next time we're going to find more about, sort of practice in the primary school classroom, because I think that would be interesting, because I could learn loads there.
Brilliant. Okay, brilliant.
Great.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Hassan, for all of your work behind the scenes.
Thank you very much, Dermot and Helen there. I told you didn't want to miss that conversation. This is going to be an ongoing thing. So we're going to, next week, hopefully with a bit of luck, we're going to have a webinar. The webinar is going to be Dermot and Helen. They're going to be answering your questions, what questions you have with regard to blended learning, what are your objectives to blended learning, and loads more. So please, we want to hear from you. But I'll give plenty of notice. I'll put it up on the CESI list. I'll put it out on Twitter. We would love to hear from you. Now, the format is going to be simple. Dermot and Helen will go online. We might have a few more presenters, And then there'll be you asking the question. So the more of you there, the better. So we genuinely, we do want to hear from you. If you have any questions, you know how to contact us. So until I see you again, take it easy. Take care.